Welcome in our next guest. That's Gareth Soloway, Chief Market Strategist for Verified Investing. Gareth, thanks for taking the time and joining us here on Friday. I know we got some stock-specific, heavy hitters that we're going to look at, but I got to ask you while we have you, what's your general thought here, the overall market? Another kind of end-of-month comeback, it seems.
Yeah, it really does. And again, whether it's end of month, as you guys were just discussing, or it's more about the wall of worry that oftentimes stocks like to climb. And I think for me, you hear all of this trade stuff going on. We heard from Trump this morning on China and what is going on there. And he's not happy one bit with the trade tensions and everything there. But I think the market participants are focusing solely on the U.S. economy. So honestly, I expect that, any trade headlines that come across, it'll be a short-term reaction. But as long as the economy stays strong and as long as inflation, like we saw in the PCE, come in muted, then investors are willing to buy into this theory that these trade wars, maybe are a positive or at least a neutral. But again, the second we see unemployment starting to rocket higher or inflation beginning to pop up, that's when the party ends.
Is it a positive, at least maybe first half step, that the market's reaction to these headlines is decreasing in magnitude, that we're starting to just become, I don't want to say complacent because it has a negative connotation, but I guess we're less surprised by them at this point, Gareth?
Yeah, and that's exactly what's happening, is that the markets are just getting immune to it in many ways because it's happened so many times. And we see these trade headlines, these new threats of tariffs, and then a day or two later we back off from these threats, and the markets are just starting to look at it as white noise. And that again means that the markets are turning their attention back to what is the data, what is the economy looking like, what are those inflation numbers.
Let's get into some of these stock-specific stories you got, and you got some technical setups for us as well. Let's start with Tesla. This stock is always making news headlines, made them again this week, particularly from the leader of the company, Elon, and his role with the administration. But they're also doing a lot of cool things when it comes to autonomous driving. We got some headlines about a potential robo-taxi launch date in Austin coming up in the next several weeks. So always news flow with this name, but it's also so actively traded, and it's always got such interesting technical setups too. Walk us through what you're paying attention to with the big time, stock here in Tesla.
Yeah, so with Tesla, it came just underneath the key 380 level. And again, that's a pivot point from when we were back in December of 2024 before it broke down substantially, right? So we're watching for this kind of level. Do we break above 380? If we break above 380, you're looking at a market on Tesla that could retest the highs of around 480. So again, very big level. You guys have a beautiful wedge that you're showing there. And again, as of now, I would fade this move looking at the big rally up off of his kind of doge backing off. And again, per the chart, we can see again into resistance here. So likely a good fade. First major support should come in around 292. I would consider being a buyer around 292.
Yeah, and it's sort of just classic risk-reward setup, right? Like you're looking at this saying, hey, we're close to some overhead supply. If you're willing to step in and play both sides of the market, a lot closer to resistance than support. If it does tag that resistance, turn around, you got to level quite a bit below here before maybe running into support. Let's talk Nvidia. We made it through earnings. Initial reaction, despite a really cloudy and noisy quarter and guidance, was higher. Now some of the macro stuff's weighed on it, but all in all, kind of an unchanged move. And I think regardless if you're bearish or bullish, unless you're super long premium one way or another, a win for all sides just to get through that event without a huge volatility event.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that. I think the market breathed a sigh of relief. It allows for the bulls to continue to be in control on this market for now, even in spite of some of the headlines we've heard, as again, Nvidia was generally positive. What was interesting, or what the chart is telling me, is that when we gapped up on earnings, we spiked right into a downsloping trend line, and it stopped Nvidia right in its path. And since then, we've seen it pull back yesterday, but also pulling back today again. And what's interesting about Nvidia today is that if we look at the price action, the stock market sold off, Nvidia sold off. The stock market is basically unchanged now. Nvidia is still down about 3%. That tells me there's relative weakness there, that there's some profit taking going on. And so I would look for further downside in the coming week on that profit taking, possibly back down. The biggest move down I would think would be back to about 116, and then look to buy that 116 to 120 level.
Considering these setups are comparable, but maybe it's a little bit more compressed with NVIDIA, when you compare and contrast the two setups in Tesla and NVIDIA, do you look at one as a little bit more favorable than the other?
It's an interesting one because, I mean, with Tesla, it's very news driven. It's very Elon Musk driven versus with NVIDIA, it's much more, how many chips are being bought, what's the revenue, what's the general kind of thought process on the semiconductor. So it's almost weirdly enough two totally separate entities.
Right.
It's not like they're both stocks and you can trade them the same way. In many ways, you have to be more careful on Tesla, in my opinion, because of the Elon Musk uncertainty factor.
Yeah, and when you look at it, NVIDIA, many might say, hey, this is a company that, yeah, I see this chart. Maybe it's a short-term bearish setup, but maybe that just means take off the longs or hedge the position. This might not be one with all the fundamental strength driving this and this growth AI boom that, some might say, hey, long only in many ways for NVIDIA. And speaking of perhaps long only, long only for Dell this week would have been interesting as this company made quite the move. What'd you make of this move in Dell and how's that changed the picture?
Yeah, so Dell's had this monstrous move from about $70 per share all the way back up to going into earnings about 115. And we saw today it kind of spiking up, but running into significant resistance. That dotted line that you guys have on the screen that marks that high on a downslope, if you extend that back, it goes right back to that high pivot going back to kind of April of last year or so. So amazing trend line of resistance right there. And that to me tells me that there's likely to see downside here in the near term, that the rally is probably a little too extended on Dell per the technicals, and probability is favoring further downside.
Yeah, and so we look at this technical setup. It can't be all that different than the technical setup in many ways of the overall market, as some of these are big-time market leaders. If we were to look at, let's say, the NASDAQ 100 or the S&P 500, are a lot of these same sort of technical setups rearing their teeth as well, or bearing their teeth as well in terms of overhead supply that's like right within striking distance?
That's exactly right. And what's happened is you had a lot of people that going into April were kind of riding near the market all-time highs, right? And then all of a sudden the bottom fell out and they were kind of left being like, holy cow, what just happened? And so now that these stocks are all coming back to those levels, you are getting new buyers, but there's also people that are saying, oh my goodness, I was down 20% on my portfolio. Now I'm back to break even. Let me take half off just to protect myself because that was such a shock when I saw the downside. And that's why these overhead support or resistance levels, I should say, work so well, is because you have these people psychologically thinking to themselves, let me protect myself a little bit. I got surprised by such a big down move. I don't want to get surprised again.
This point is such a good one. I always say you find out how big a small position is in times of volatility like April, and it's so funny how often you're comfortable getting put that stock below until it happens. So very, very fascinating conversation, as a lot of these technical setups are setting up for what might be short-term, to Gareth's point, maybe bearish setups. So appreciate it. You have a great weekend. Always a pleasure to catch up. Gareth Soloway of Verified Investing.